I slightly changed the title to Ethnic Missing in Early Childhood. Okay, so this is a joint work with Vincent Boucher from Canada, Laval, Semir Tumin from TED in Turkey, Michael Velastapoulos and Jacqueline Waba from Southampton. Okay, so let me motivate the paper and the idea and what do we do in this paper. So we know that there have been a lot of forced migration around the world, and a lot of refugees have been moving around, as we know. For example, if you look at the number, you have 70 million worldwide, right? And 26 million refugees who have been displaced in 2019. And of course, this creates major issue for the host country to integrate these refugees and also to try to give them a proper education. So in this paper, we will focus on the integration of refugee children in the education system. And we will mostly talk about integration of Syrian refugees in Turkey. And you will see the number are staggering, really important. I mean, Turkey took a lot of Syrian kids, which, as you will see, are here to stay. They will not go back home. So it's really an important question about integration of these kids in this new society. And so in this paper, basically, the question we ask is that if we mix refugee children with host children, but in early childhood, does it help for integration? We know that there's a lot of paper, you know, like the contact theory, where they try to mix adults and see the effect. But our idea is that if it doesn't work already when you are 5 years old or 6 years old, then it's going to be even more complicated to integrate when they get older. Okay, so what we do, first we start with a random field experiment in Turkey. It's a summer camp, you will see, and these kids spend 2 months in the summer camps. And what we did is that they go to different classrooms. So we manipulate the classroom so that the fraction of Syrian refugees in the classroom change randomly. So some people are exposed to many Syrian kids, some are exposed to few, and we want to see how does it have an impact on different outcome. You will see we will be socialization, will be network formation, how friendship form, and language skill. The second part of the paper is, okay, now we understand with this experiment what's going on, but we want to put some structure. So we develop a very simple model of friendship formation or network formation, whereas there will be these two elements that be important. The first thing is that you have what we call the preference bias homophily. So of course, if you a Syrian kid, you prefer naturally to interact with another Syrian kid. And also there will be the congestion bias. The fact that, of course, if you have very few Syrian kids around you, well, you're less likely to be friends with Syrian kids because there's nobody around. So we're going to look at these two ideas. We're going to generate some interesting coverage statistics and understand the field experiment. But then we go a bit further. We will structurally estimate the model to see how much it feeds the data. And then the last part, which is nice when you do structural estimation, we can perform some counterfactual experiments. So for example, what would have happened if the Syrian kid become fluent in Turkish? Or if there is less ethnic discrimination, or if there's less congestion. So we can see different things in the simulation, and of course, hopefully draw some policy conclusion that about this mixing of these kids. What we find quickly before starting the paper is that we look at 3 outcomes in the random field experiments. One of them is called the Prosocial Behavior. So it's a lab in the field where you basically make this kid play dictator game, and you ask them how much they give to themselves, how much they give to the other kid in the classroom. We have information about the network, so we see with whom they are friends, if they're friends with Syrian kids or with non-Syrian kids. And for the Syrian kid only, we're going to look at language skill. From the random field experiment, what we find is that the Turkish children are affected by the composition of the refugee in the classroom. So what we find is that they tend to have, when you have more and more refugee around them, Syrian refugee, they tend to be more prosocial behavior, right? And they tend to have more interethnic friendship. Now, for Syrian children, the effect is very weak. There's very big effect on how they make friendship and also the social behavior. And finally, what we show, which is not surprising, is that the worse you speak a language, which is Turkish in that case, the less likely the Syrian will form links with Turkish kids. So that's just the field experiments. Then we go to the model and the structure estimation. Again, we have the same outcome for the model, and we try to explain why. You will see why we have the result from the reduced form. And we show that when we estimate the model and structure estimate it, we see that Syrian children tend to socialize less than Turkish kids. They tend to have a stronger test for conformity. It's a conformity model. Of course, links between ethnicity is less likely that within ethnicity, and language skill affect, obviously, the formation between different kids. And the last part, quickly, what we obtain on the counterfactual policy, we look mostly at what is called inbreeding homophily. So homophily is just the share of your friend which have the same ethnicity. However, it's interesting, but you have to know exactly the share in the classroom. So the inbreeding homophily is how much you deviate from the share in the classroom. So let's say you have 10% of Syrian kids in your classroom, and you have 20% of your friends which are Syrian, then you have positive inbreeding homophily. So you deviate from that. So what we find is that you find this non-monotonic relationship. So when you increase the Syrian kids, it's not always beneficial because people tend to be even more inbreeding homophily. And this is a bit in contrast to what the contact theory shows, that you always need to mix people. It's always good. We show that it can backfire. Okay, when you have too much of refugees, then it can backfire. And we do an interesting exercise when we try to make Syrian kids fluent in the simulation, and we show that it has a big effect in terms of friendship relationship, is equivalent to reducing the ethnic bias by 50%. Okay, so this is basically the result that I want to go through. It's a lot of them, but hopefully we'll be able to go through. So again, the key insights that I want to highlight in this paper is this idea that, well, mixing people is good, but it can backfire, so you have to be careful. And so if you want to integrate these kids, you should take into account not only the contact, but also the sociability of this kid, the language skill, and the exposure of the other ethnicity. Okay, so here is the roadmap of my presentation. Background, the field experiments, the result from the field experiments, the model, structure estimation, and the counterfactual policy. Okay, so what is the background? So we all know, I mean, we have heard about this huge war in Syria and the refugees. And so it's been like 10 years now, it's a long time. And there's this huge refugee from Syria, 7 million people. And we know that a lot of them have been hosted by neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. But there's a very important, and you use this number, immigration to Turkey, which is very close. And the problem is that, of course, most of these kids after 10 years are not going back. So they're not going back to Syria. So it's like a permanent move to this country. So, of course, for Turkey, and one of our co-authors, Semir, work at the government. So we know exactly the objectives of this government. Basically, they want to socially integrate the Syrian refugee, and it's a very big challenge for Turkey. So this is what we want to do. If you look at Turkey, the number are staggering. 3.6 million Syrian refugees are living in Turkey. 1 million of them are between 5 and 7 years old, and they go to school. And so now they try to, after 10 years, they try to fully integrate these kids in the Turkish public education system. And there's a lot of focus on this early childhood when the kids are young, like 5 years old, which is easier to integrate. How do we do to integrate them? So what we do here, I mean, the government organized this summer school program in July, August 2019, right? In many provinces and many schools. And our target here is 5 years old Turkish and Syrian kids, right? So they go to this summer camp before starting the fall semester of the academic year. The curriculum is done by the Minister of National Education in Turkey, and the teacher are assigned from them, right? And so we try, they try to incentivize them to come to the camp by giving some snack and nutritious and stuff like that. So the goal of the program from the education is really to early childhood education for these kids, integrate these kids, education, language skill, and of course, multicultural education to understand the other culture. And as you know, I mean, I don't have to remind that, but even though Turkish and Syrian kids are of the same religion, which is Sunni Muslim, they are very differently in terms of cultural differences. In particular, they speak a different language. So Arabic in one and Turkish is the one which is different. So there's a lot of difference culturally that it is important to integrate. So the field experiment we are looking here that we have implemented is in Gaziantep. I will give you the in the map. It's very close to the frontier with Aleppo in Syria. It's very, very close. So you have a lot of share of course, Syrian refugees. So you have half of a million which are Syrian refugees. We had a lot of kids going to this school. And what we did is that we randomly identified 40 schools, right? And among of them, look at 11 of them to implement our experiment. And so here, if you want to see the map of Turkey, this is Gaziantep. You see it's very close to Aleppo. This is Syria, and this is Turkey. So it's very close from each other. And this is the random school we choose, this 11 school we choose to implement our experiments. So we have, in 11 schools, we have 36 classroom or group, right? Where the kids are integrated. And this group could be between 10 and 24, right? And what we do, this is our experiment, we mix classroom between different decile. And so some classrooms have a high refugee share, like more than 70%. Some classrooms have a medium refugee share, between 38 and 70%. And some classrooms have a low refugee share. So you have different one, which is totally exogenous, obviously. And of course, you cannot switch between group and school. And this is what we end up with that, very few attrition. So we end up with 600 students in different male and female and refugee and non-refugee. So we collected, which is interesting, we see twice our data at the beginning of the program, like 1 week after, and at the end of the program. We measure Turkish language skill before and after. We measure also friendship networks before and after, and we measure in a standard way, which is self-reported best friend. You ask them to give them the best friends. And what we do in the lab, in the field, we do this sticker game, which is basically a measure of prosocial behavior. So you ask each kid, you give them 10 stickers, and they have to decide how many they keep for themselves and how many they give to any other people in the classroom. They don't direct to a certain person, they just give it to someone in the classroom. But of course, they're aware of how many Syrian and Syrian kids are in the classroom. So, and of course, we have a lot of information about education and parents, when they arrive, what kind of trauma they experience in Syria and stuff like that. So here's our empirical strategy for the reduced form equation, right? So basically, we look at the outcome at time 2, at the end of the summer camp, right? For an kids I belonging to group G, right? As a function of his own outcome when you arrive, okay? And this is the control variable. And of course, the key variable here is this beta, which is the exposure rate. So the fraction of refugee Syrian kids in your classroom or in your group G here. And of course, this is exogenous, and we want to see how this impacts that. And the outcome, as I told you before, are socialization through the sticker game, friendship relationship with whom you are friends, I mean, same ethnicity or not, and language skill for the Syrian kids. And we're going to look also for nonlinear effect by looking at different tercile or decile to see if the effects are there. Okay, so let's start with the first outcome, which is the prosocial behavior. So these kids are in different classrooms, and we ask them to play this game, and then we want to see how they behave. So these are the Turkish kids, right? So this is a linear specification. This is a non-linear one. And what you see, of course, what you see clearly, and I give you, okay, what you see for the Turkish kids, sorry, is that you have this negative and statistically significant effect of refugee cheer on the sharing. So basically, the more they're exposed to Syrian kids, the less they give. Okay, that's the first. So they socialize less, if you interpret socialization of this sticker game, the more they are exposed to refugee kids. Okay, again, it's not, we don't direct this yet, but you can guess that you have an impact here. And you can have some nonlinear effects. The more you increase, it's much higher if you're above the medium than below the medium. So for example, if you want to understand in terms of magnitude, so a Turkish kid in a high refugee share group, so above 70%, we give nearly 2 stickers less out of 10 than a kid in a low refugee, less than 30%. So it's like 40% on what a Turkish kid give on average. So it's quite a big effect. For Syrian kids, the effect is very small and even not statistically significant. So they don't discriminate. So this is the first result that, of course, we try to understand with the model, is that it seems that Syrian kids socialize less, who are not affected by the refugee chair, whereas the Turkish kids are affected in terms of socialization effort. That's one thing that we want to understand, because when you do a pure random experiment, you get some result, but it's difficult to understand the mechanism behind that. And we try to give you some mechanism. That's the first result I want you to keep in mind. The second result, which I think are important, are what about friendship regression? So, so this is for Turkish kids, same ethnic friendship. So we look at the number of Turkish friends or the share. It doesn't change a lot, okay? So, and this is a non-year effect. So what you find for the Turkish kids is that you have a negative effect of exposure to refugee children. So the more you have exposed to Syrian refugees, the less you choose friends which are Turkish, which are like you. So this is in line with the contact hypothesis, is that the more they discover, and again, remember, they arrive, and then after 2 months, of course, you look at how much friendship change here. The magnitude, if you want, is if you have a 1 standard deviation increase in refugee share, will lead to a 0.24 decrease in the number of Turkish friends. And the mean number is 1.8, okay? So you have this effect, which is relatively big. which is the contact theory. And what about the Syrian kids? The effect, as you can see, is a positive of even not significant. So basically, the share of refugee, right, exert a positive but weaker effect on your own ethnicity. So if you're Syrian, the more there is Syrian around you, the more likely you're going to be friends with Syrian kids, but the effect is very small. So this is the opposite effect, and this is something we want to understand. Why people change? Is it due, I don't know, to preference bias? Is it due to congestion? Is it due to language skill? This is things we want to understand, and the only way to understand is really to write a model and to go deeper than that. So, for example, so we understand that for Turkish kids, they are very affected by these refugees. And then we can plot, and I will come back on that, just from the data, this homophily index, not the inbreeding one, just homophily, which is just the share of friends of same ethnicity. This is from the data. So if you see, when you do from the data, there's a lot of noise, right? But still you see this tendency of increasing for both of them, okay? And of course, you see it's much more steeper. For the Turkish, it's much more significant. And it will be very interesting to see the same figure when you simulate the model to see what's going on with that. Okay, and the last aspect I wanted to tell you is about the language skill regression. Okay, so we want to see if you are more likely to be better in Turkish the more you are exposed or less by other refugee kids, if you are Syrian, obviously. So we have this variable which is assessed by the teacher, okay, and it's reported between a scale of 1 to 7, and we say that you are fluent or you are high skilled if you are above 4, and below you are not high skilled. And so what you find is that there is a strong effect. The more Syrian are with Syrian kids in their classroom, the lower is the language skill in Turkey. Okay, so which is not surprising. And of course, the more you come with a high language skill at the beginning, the more you have a high skill at the end of the summer camp. So this is, remember, when you arrive, they test you in language skill, and this is the impact on 2 months after, and this is the impact of refugee cheer. So the effect of refugee is negative, statistically significant. So if you put a lot of Syrian kids around Syrian kids, not surprisingly, they're going to speak Arabic to each other, and they will not improve a lot their level of Turkish, and the effect is even non-linear. So something which we have there. So let me summarize what we obtain from the field experiment, right? So the first thing we obtain is that we have this prosocial behavior that we call prosocial behavior, is that how much you give to other people than yourself, right? And Turkish kids give less the more they are faced with Syrian kids. So this has a negative effect on them. So they tend to be in-group favoritism for them. Okay. And the magnitude is roughly 1.9 sticker less when you are in a high share of refugee as opposed to a low share. Now, for Syrian kids, there's no affected. Okay. So this is the first thing. Socialization vary between Turkish and Syrian, and we need to understand what's going on here. The second aspect is friendship formation. Again, Turkish kids are very affected by the share, and the more you have Syrian kids around you, the less you tend to be friends with other Turkish kids. So less homophily. And I give you the number here, the one standard deviation increase with roughly 0.24 decrease in the number or the fraction, it depends the way you want to interpret that. Syrians do not seem to be affected by that, right? And then the last part is language skill. Well, of course, language skill affect are affected by exposure to refugees. The more you have refugees around you who speak the same language than you, Arabic, the less you're going to improve your language skill. Okay, so this is a field experiment that gives you some idea. I didn't discuss the related literature, but there's a big literature in contact theory, where usually, to my knowledge, there's no paper on young kids, but usually you take refugees, which are adult or students, and they try to see if you mix different ethnicity, what will happen, right? So there is paper in US college when you mix white and black, and you see that, and you have other paper in South Africa, in many countries. What you see is this literature show that contact theory is good, that usually people change their prejudice against the other ethnicity. However, all this literature is purely field experiments or assignments or IV, but we don't know exactly what's going on, the mechanisms behind that, and why this behavior affect you. So this is what we try to go a bit further here. Of course, the difficulty here, if you know network theory, is to drive a relatively simple model that matches the data. These are 5 years old, so they are very young kids, but you need to have both socialization and network formation, which is complicated. So we're going to do a relatively simple model, which we capture that, we hope so. So imagine a population of students in a classroom, like we have NT are Turkish, NS are Syrian, ethnicity is E, and I is who you are. So as in the econometrics that I show you in the reduced form, Q is a fraction of Syrian kid in your classroom, right? So NS over N, and 1 minus Q is a share of Turkish children. Okay, so I'm going to look at the network formation model where the key driving force are preference bias and congestion. So on the one hand, naturally, you know, for example, think about language, you prefer if you Syrian to talk to a Syrian kid because to be friend with him because you speak the same language or you have the same cultural value. However, there's congestion, and the congestion is this Q. It depends how many people around you are like you or not. If there's very few Turkish kids around or Syrian, it will affect your formation. This is what we want to capture. Okay. So let's start with the network formation model. So basically, it's a random model where the probability of forming a link between student I and student J is equal to this value. What does it mean, this value? Well, delta Ij is what we call the preference bias, but it's pairwise. Okay, it's 2 by 2. So in the data will be different in language skill, or different of education, or different of gender, or whatever. So this is 2 by 2. So of course, the lower is this value, the less homophily you have here, the less likely you're going to form a link. Okay, this is just an homophily parameter. Now, what is key is this S. S is what we call in the experiment the socialization, the prosocialization effort, right? But here it will be endogenous. I will show you how we determine. So now, how do you form link? Is, well, the more social you are, if ing are very social, the more likely they're going to form a link. But then below, and I will explicit that before, it depends on socialization effort of everybody in the classroom, right? So this is a congestion aspect. So basically, this is a model which is a way to avoid the standard problem you have in network formation. Because, you know, if you do network formation 2 by 2, I say, oh, I want to be friends with Carl. I want to be friends with Omar. Then you have a combinatory problem. And the result is that, is well known by Jackson and Wolanski, is that you don't have a unique equilibrium, you have million of equilibrium. It's very difficult to do that. So we have, I have an old paper in Game-Making Behavior in 2011, where we try to say, instead of directing you formation, let's do it through socialization, okay? And by doing so, you can solve the problem, have a unique solution. So this is a link formation, but as you can understand here is a probability. So in probability, what is probability to form links? Then of course you can calculate in expectation how many friends you will have. That's everything you can calculate here, okay? So what is key is that how the socialization effort are determined, well, is relatively simple. This is this utility function. And I don't know if you've seen that before, it's called a conformist utility function. So basically, the first part here is the utility you get by yourself, okay? So you have to decide how much socialization or how much ticket you want to give. This is only dependent on yourself, right? So what is key is BI. BI is the observable and unobservable characteristics that you have, which is if you are Turkish, language skill, education of your parents, refugee, whatever. So this is everything you observe and you don't observe that affect your socialization effort. Now, the second part is the social part. And in every conformist model, what you do is that you don't want to deviate from the norm in your reference group. So this is a social norm in whatever group you want to refer to. Here, obviously, will be the classroom. Okay? So S bar minus I is the average socialization in your classroom. And this is where the Q will enter. It will depend, of course, how many Syrian and Turkish kids you have here. And what's happened here, each time your SI deviate from the norm, you pay this cost. So the kappa here is the test for conformity. If kappa is very high, you have a very high cost to deviate from the norm, right? And if kappa is low, that's what you have. You put a square to avoid to do on the right and the left side. So that's relatively standard. And basically, just for you to remember, S bar minus I is the average solution effort in your classroom, leaving out yourself. And BI is you ex ante heterogeneity, could be observable or not observable. And kappa I is just the test for conformity. So you can solve the first condition you have to do for all of these kids. And you have this weighted average, as you can see, between your own characteristics and the social norm. So if you're very conformist, you put a lot of weight on the norm. If not very conformist, you put a lot of weight on yourself. As you can see, I just changed the variable kappa to phi because then it gives you a nicer expression. So it's a very simple model, but it's very, even it's simple, it's complicated to solve analytically if you want to have that. So, okay, so to solve the model, we'll not do that in the estimation. Let's assume that all Turkish kids have the same characteristics and all the Syrian kids have the same characteristics. Then I define as before Q, the fraction of refugee kids, right? And S bar is the expected or the social norm in your classroom. What is it? Is the fraction of Syrian kid time the socialization effort that decide plus the fraction of Turkish kid time the socialization effort that decide, right? So I can solve the first order condition, right? Again, remember, is an expectation because there is a probability that I form links, okay? So I'm going to get 1 minus phi times this B plus phi times the norm minus myself, right? And then you can solve it. The good thing, you can solve it analytically, everything. So you get that SI, SS, and ST will depend on this parameter. Now, if you go back to the experiment, what do you learn here? Well, you remember that for Syrian kids, they were not socializing. There was no effect of refugee kids. So in that case, it means for Syrian kids, it should be that the test for conformity is very, very big. If you're very, very conformist, right, then what's happened is that your effort will only depend on your own character, of the character of the other kids. You don't care about yourself, and it will be independent of Q, right? And of course, in the estimation, I will estimate the value of conformity for all of these kids. Okay. Then when you have the S, you plug it back here in the probability to form links. So just to see how does it work is simple. Imagine I want to look at the probabilities that 2 Turkish kids will form a link. Well, they're going to be these homophily parameters. So of course, they're more likely to form links if they have the same gender or the same education of the parent and everything like that. Now it will depend on both effort of socialization. And the key part, this is a congestion. It will depend on, of course, how many Turkish kids you have in the classroom. So 1 minus Q, remember, is the Turkish kid in the classroom, minus 1 because I want to remove myself. So this is a congestion effect, okay? When I look at the formation between a Turkish and a Syrian kids, now I need to look at the congestion only on the Syrian kids, right? And of course, it's going to depend on ST and SS and so forth. Okay, so for example, so I think it's relatively clear here. So we can have, and we can explain now with this simple model, this reduced form estimation, right? So we can see if you do choristatics, how the priority to form links increase or decrease with Q. So basically, remember the number of stickers, which is an imperfect measure of socialization, was decreasing in the share of Syrian kids for Turkish kids. Well, to get that, right, to get S decreasing, it has to be that BS is then that BT. So on average, the countries are lower. And for the Syrian kids, the test for conformity, as I told you before, have to be close to 1. Then in that case, they will not be affected by the share. And this will imply that the Syrian kids will be less prone to socialization as we find in the data. Okay, so the idea is that when you have classroom with a higher share of Syrian kids, okay, you have smaller socialization norm for these kids. And of course, everybody will socialize less. That's the idea, okay? So this is things we want to test. And of course, we can explain also why you have more PTS. Yeah, sure. Sorry, Tom.
Will you please elaborate a little bit more on the last statement, the last bullet of your...
Yeah, sure. This one, yeah. So
yes, exactly.
Why Syrian kids will be less prone to socialization, right? So basically, it is a case when the test conformity is quite close to 1, right? So in that case, when you have more and more Syrian kids in the classroom, we show that they have no effect on socialization of the Syrian kid. Remember, in the reduced form. Then what's happened is that because they socialize less, right, the S will be much smaller. Social norm is the average of your norm, okay? And in turn, this implies a much smaller socialization for everybody. Because basically, you have less people, you have less socialization, and you get that. Okay, and then we will estimate more likely. So the model can explain all the results, but it's not enough. You want really to structurally estimate the model to be sure about the value of the phi. Is phi for the Syrian close to 1 or not? Is it true that Syrian are more conformist than the other kids? That we don't know. So, okay, so again, just to remember, there is these 2 equations you need. Yeah.
And you're assuming that the reference is the same for the Turkish and the Syrians, and they give a look to the mean of the S. What is the Turkish at only giving a look to the Turkish?
So yeah, we could do that, but then it will be straightforward, because the problem, you know, if you do that, then in that case you don't have the effect you want, right? Because what we want to see is that how Q affect you. But if you don't care about the Q is a fraction of refugees. If you do what you do, Q will have no effect on you, and this is not what we observe in the data in the field experiment. You see what I mean? You need, I mean, we show in the field experiment that Turkish kids care about the Syrian, and they're affected not only in terms of socialization, but also of link formation. So if you do what you do, they will not care about at all. And then you, I mean, mixing doesn't affect them.
Okay.
You see? So it is because, so basically, again, every kid that has this trade-off. On the one hand, they look at their own characteristics, which affect socialization. On the other hand, they look at the social norm in the classroom. But this social norm, as you say, is the same for everybody without yourself. So it's not exactly the same, but roughly the same, if you want. Is everybody minus yourself, right? But of course, this norm changed because of the mixing. In some classroom, you have 90% of Turkish kids. So in that case, of course, the norm is mostly Turkish kids. But in some classroom, you are exposed to 10% of Turkish kids. then the norm is very different. And this is what we want to understand. And this is what the data is telling us, that people are affected by that. Okay, so so that's and by the way, what you say, we can check in the data. We can check that if phi is very close to 0, then the Turkish kid will not care at all about the Syrian kid. We check when we estimate the model. Okay, so remember these two equations. The first one is this one, which is coming from this conformist model, and the second one is this link formation. A link formation, two things which are key is the homophily parameters and the congestion parameter. So what we do standard GMM. So we estimate these two equations at the same time, association effort and network formation. I will not get into detail, but basically we have moments that we match. And then what we obtain is that. So when you estimate these two equations, this is what you obtain. Okay? And this is, remember, the association effort. And by the way, we assume that association effort is captured by the sticker game, but with some error. So it's not perfectly captured by that. Okay? So basically, what you obtain is interesting. Is exactly what we had in mind from the theory, is that the conformity or the test for conformity of Syrian kids is very close to 1. They're extremely conformist, whereas for these kids, they're much lower, and it's very significant. So we see that indeed the test for conformity is different between Syrian and Turkish kids, with the other one close to 1. We see also that Syrian, as I told you before, socialize less than Turkish kids from the estimation. And we see that, of course, the more you are fluent in Turkish for Syrian, right, the higher is your association effort. What about the network formation effect? Well, what you see, not surprisingly, is that it's more likely to have, within ethnicity friendship than between ethnicity. That's not surprising. And Syrian pair are more likely to form than Turkish pair. If you're fluent, as we said, it's more likely that you are friends with other people. And if you're already friends at the beginning of the summer camp, you're more likely to be friends afterwards. So this is what I show you. So again, we can look again at the interpretation that I told you before. We see that Syrian children socialize less. So now it's different. The model is estimated. It means that, again, these ideas that Carlos was asking, we see that Syrian children have a stronger test for conformity, meaning, again, they will be less affected by the fraction of Syrian kids in the classroom. And we find, again, that interethnic links are less likely to be formed than within ethnic links. And you have this persistent effect, the fact that if you're linked before, you still link afterwards. And of course, language do affect. So now the last thing I want to do is to do some counterfactual policy. And we will focus, because of the aim of this policy is really to say, what about integration? Is, well, we focus mostly of homophily and inbreeding homophily. So let me define formally. So homophily is just the fraction of your friend which have the same ethnicity. So very simple. Now, what is inbreeding homophily? Well, Q, remember, is a fraction of Syrian kids if you are Syrian. So for Syrian kid will be how much you deviate from the fraction in your classroom. Again, if you have 30% in your classroom which are Syrian, how many of your friends are above or below this number? So again, if your homophily is above the fraction of kids in your classroom, then you have positive, or what we call inbreeding homophily, positive. If you are below the threshold, then you have negative. And what is key is when it's equal to 0, right? So if you want integration, you want people to not to have inbreeding homophily, because it means that they are very between themselves. So you want people to integrate, and this is one objective would be that exactly you have 0. So this value is 0, meaning that they just choose the fraction of friend which correspond to the classroom. Okay, that will be one way. The more you have inbreeding homophily, the less good it is, because then less likely for friendship formation between different kids, right? So of course, what we do is that when we do that, it's nice because we can do simulation. So we have 30 classes, but when you do simulation, we do 500 times. You have much bigger one. So you just reshuffle 500 times all these kids, and then we see what's happened when you change this Q everywhere, right? So here, counterfactual policy, right? And things I want you to keep in mind is that it's a simulation of the model, not the data. So the model have always these two aspects, congestion and homophily, okay? So if I only look at homophily index, right? So not inbreeding, then of course you have this mechanical increase because you know, you don't care about how many fractions you have there. You just increase more and more the same friendship. And of course, for Turkish, you have to start from the right and go to the left. So just to remember here, these are different decile of refugee chair. So here you have very few refugee and then you increase. Here, if you start here, you have 100% refugees or 0% Turkish, and then you increase. So the same way like that. So this is not surprising, and it's interesting to see this is the simulation of the model, and this is what the data is telling you. So the data is much more noisy, obviously. But more importantly is the next one. So again, just to understand the homophilies that I show you here from the model, and this is from the data, is that you have this interpretability, preference bias, and congestion. I want you to keep in mind that. So if you have Syrian kids, right, they are always positively biased toward other Syrian kids. Naturally, they want to be like that, right? So homophily will increase because you always want to be friends with Syrian kids, right? But the problem is that you have some congestion. You know, the more you have kids, the more you have congestion about Syrian kids here. You know, think about a classroom, right? And we have, I don't know, you have 2 Syrian kids in the classroom. Well, the point is that their form link is 1, basically. But now if you have 10 Syrian kids, well, then you have to compete for friendships. And then you are less likely to have friendship. You're still increasing, but at a decreasing rate. And this is what we want to understand. But inbreeding homophily is much more interesting because it's deviation from the classroom. So here what you get. So this is a simulation of our model for inbreeding homophily. And this is why I told you this non-linear relationship. So this is Syrian kid, Turkish kid. Remember, the worst case is here. This is when you have the maximum of inbreeding homophily. And this is the lowest one. Okay, and same thing for Turkish kid. So before I interpret this curve, look at that. It's very interesting. These are the simulation of the model 500 times. Look, this is what the data is telling you. Nearly no effect. So if you do just a pure reduced form estimation and you look at the data, there's no effect of inbreeding homophily. So it's really by putting structure and understanding this idea between congestion and bias that you get something from the data. Okay, so just it's important why we need that. Okay, so what do we get? First, we get this non-monotonic relationship again of this stuff. But let me give you the number. So for Syrian kids, the maximal inbreeding homophily is at 36%. So when you have 36% of kids which are Syrian in your classroom, you are deviating at the maximum. This is where you deviate the maximum from this 36%. Okay. Now, when you have not the minimum, but when is equal to 0, which is what you want, is when you have 60%. Okay. So when you have 60% of kids which are Syrian kids also have 60% of their friends which are Syrian. Okay. So this is what you see is that it's not linear. That it's not by increasing the contact you're going to increase integration. In that case, you see that the effect is different. For Turkish kids, the effect is different. Is that the maxima is that when you have a lot of Syrian kids around, this is where it backfires. So when you put them with a lot of Syrian kids, they tend to be extremely inbreeding homophilous. So they tend to go much more for Turkish kids. Whereas the best thing for them is when you have much less Syrian kids. So you see when you have 50-50, the Turkish tend to be more integrated. But when you put too many Syrian kids, they really backfire here. That's where you get that. And you see from the figure. Okay, so that's what you see from the first things, and you understand why you have that. Okay, Carlos, how much time I have left? Is it 5-10 minutes? I don't know.
I think you have about 5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 is perfect. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so of course the good thing that you can do with structural econometrics is that you can do counterfactual policies that you cannot do obviously with field experiments. So what we do now, we say, well, we know there is this preference bias that you want to be people like you. And in the data, the way we capture that is to look at difference in language, difference in gender, difference in many things, but in a difference in ethnicity, obviously. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to simulate the model. What will happen if there were no ethnic bias between Syrian and Turkish kids, or if there is twice as much as ethnic bias that we obtain in the data. So yeah, and then this is what you get. So this is Syrian kids, this is Turkish kids, and just for you to know, this is no ethnic bias. This is the one we obtain from the data, and this is where you double the ethnic bias. You see that you are shifting forward here. So you see when you look at the max, for example, before, the max is here. So you see that it's much below here and much below here. I will give you the number, and same thing for, so you're really shifting above that. So you see, for example, when you get the minimum Inbreeding Homophily is shift above here. So let me give you the exact number if you want to see. So let's see for the Syrian. So when there is no ethnic bias, right, and you want to integrate this kid, it's sufficient to have only 35% of these kids which are, with 50-50 is perfect. So if you put 50% of Syrian kids and Turkish kids, then there's good integration. People just follow what you have here. When you have baseline, so you have some ethnic bias, you need to increase by 60. But when you have a lot of ethnic bias, you need to have 76% of Syrian kids for not having inbreeding homophily. And you can look at the number for max, but you see that huge number with difference with that you can quantify. And that's the problem that you have here is that you can simulate why ethnic bias is so important. And this is not surprising. You know, when you have double ethnic bias, it means people are extremely prejudiced with other, right? So they really don't want to form links. The only way they're going to form link is because there's congestion. Maybe they will form link because there's very, very few Turkish kids around, and I'm not going to have a Turkish friend. But when you have no ethnic bias, it means that the only thing that driving the links are either gender difference or anything that you observe, or congestion. But now you have no prejudice with respect to the other guy. So another exercise we can do, which is not surprising, is to say, well, what will happen to the model if we remove congestion, right? So this is a model without congestion, and with congestion, where what you see is that it's mechanical. If there's no congestion, then of course, even inbreeding homophily will increase with the classroom. So the two last, I think, simulations really to show you the importance of ethnic bias if you want to address policy. And the second one is the importance of congestion. Okay, congestion is mixing basically. The problem is that, of course, in policy, well, how can you change ethnic bias? If people are prejudiced, it's very difficult to change. And now we're going to show you a way to do it. Again, you have to remember that we're talking about 5 years old. So if at 5 years old already they have a lot of problem of interacting, it's going to be very difficult to integrate that 10 years afterwards. So it's very important. This is why I think this is the first study about 5 years old and integration, which is important. Okay, so now, fine, that's fine. Now the last one we do, which is interesting, is say, well, we know that Turkish kids play an important idea. What will have happened now if you give language fluency to all Syrian kids? Suddenly they become fluent and that's contrary to ethnicity bias. You can play, you can help them to become better in the language, right? So here what you get. So And we compare with ethnic bias. So basically, I don't know if you see the one below is no ethnic bias. This is the baseline. And here, the last one is no language barrier, okay, for both of them. Let me give you the interpretation, it's easier. So we compare the baseline with situations where they have no preference bias and one when it's fluent. And we want to see if there is some kind of an equivalence. So what you find is that if you make every Syrian kid fluent in Turkish, it's roughly halfway between the baseline and the one in ethnic bias. Basically, it reduced by 50%. So you don't totally remove ethnic bias, but you remove half of the ethnic bias by making people language skilled. Again, I'm sure that if I do the same model for adults, the effect is must be much smaller. Why? Because 5 years old, there are some prejudice, but it's not huge, right? And at that age, they want to play with each other, and language is important. But if you have people who are 25 years old, I mean, prejudice is there. If you have black and white, I mean, prejudice is important. So even if, I don't know, you give them language for, if you take an immigrant with a native guy, still there's so much ethnic bias that the effect must be much smaller. That's why we have that. So if you look, for example, if you have 50% of Syrian kids in the classroom, right, and you make them fluent, right? So basically this Inbreeding Homophily is 57% the difference between the bias and the non-biased case. So basically, it's important that if you make these kids fluent early, you get this decreasing in of course, ethnic bias. And of course, this implies much more links between Turkish and kids. So of course, that's a long, strong impact on language. It's interesting because, as I said before, it's very difficult to change prejudice between kids, but of course, you can change language acquisition. So let me conclude. I can summarize, but I don't think it's very important, but I think you understand. So we did all these kind of things. But what about policy? I don't know if you know this recent paper, like 2 or 3 years ago. In the US, you have this policy by Shetty et al. So basically, you have this policy where they try to move people around. It's called the Moving to Opportunity Program. It's a big program in the US for 40 years. So what they did, they go to very poor area and they give vouchers and they say, who want to move? And of course, they look at selection and they say, I'm going to pay you the housing price difference if you move to a better area. Okay? And then they see what's happened 10 years after in terms of crime, education, and so forth. And the effect will mix. Okay. And recently, Ray Shetty and co-author find this interesting result that shows that the program is effective only if the kids move when he's below 13 years old. After that, no. And why? He said because when you are young enough and you go to this new, usually it's black kids or Hispanic kids which are poor, going to more white neighborhood. And what they show is that if you are above 13, you're not going to make new contact, new friendships. There's all this ethnicity bias and stuff like that. And the effect is clearly nearly zero. And a lot of people go back to the neighborhood after some time. However, if you move the kids when they are 10, 9, or below 13, the effect is very positive on education and on crime. So in some way, I mean, of course, it's a very different context and stuff like that. It seems that mixing, and again, these are pure field experiments. They don't know why. Because, when you move people around, you don't know why the effect is there. You don't know if there's more police in the new area, better school. Of course, you try to control, but you don't know the mechanisms. Here, what we say is that, well, given if you believe in the model, we say that it's because, of course, when you move very young, it's easier for this kid to make relationship. And of course, they have less prejudice with each other and easier for them to make friendship relationship. So the conclusion of what I say is that you need to expose more. The more you expose each other to different kids, the less prejudice. And of course, in that case, when you have language skill problem, which is not the case in the US, then you should improve also the integration by language skill. Okay, I think it's okay for time. Thank you.